When you were a kid, they told you that you could be anything. They told you that you were destined for greatness. They gave you wax wings and pointed at the sun.
Right.
But they never told you what happens when you turn 35, look at your life and realize, well, you are completely, entirely average. Tonight, we explore the Fall of Icarus and the terrifying psychological trauma of not being special. Welcome to the debate.
Yes. Welcome. And that image, the modern Icarus, is really at the core of the psychological and sociological text we are diving into today.
Yeah, it is a profoundly dark yet undeniably resonant way to look at modern adulthood.
It really is. I mean, it frames this ancient Greek myth not as some, distant morality tale about obeying your parents, but as a direct, devastating allegory for the modern psychological trauma of averageness.
Absolutely. We are looking at the crippling weight of these societal expectations we are all just, forced to carry.
Exactly. And the central question we are unpacking today is a terrifying one. When we realize we aren't special, when we experience that fall of Icarus, is that crash into mediocrity a necessary, liberating return to reality? Or is it a brutal, unsurvivable punishment inflicted by a hyper-capitalist society?
Well, I will argue that letting go of the ego and surviving the fall into mediocrity is the only true path to liberating ourselves from toxic societal expectations.
And I will argue that modern society does not allow you to be average in peace. The fall is a brutal, humiliating drowning in a system that only values those who touch the sun.
So to really get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the mechanics of where these wings even came from. Why are we up in the sky in the first place?
Right? The setup.
Exactly. The text identifies the foundational lie of modern culture as the manufacturing of toxic positivity. Think about the self-esteem movement that really kicked into high gear a few decades ago.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't just about making sure kids felt loved. It evolved into this pervasive, almost religious doctrine of exceptionalism. Every single child was told they were destined to change the world. You are going to be extraordinary. You are going to be wildly successful.
It essentially became a moral imperative. If you aren't changing the world, what are you even doing?
Precisely. It is a statistical impossibility disguised as a baseline expectation. You are handed these wax wings of toxic positivity, you strap them on, and you spend your 20s flapping as hard as you can.
Just exhausting yourself.
Right. And then what happens? You hit your 30s or 40s, the math of life stops mathing. The trajectory isn't exponential anymore, it is flatlining. The illusion shatters, and you realize you are completely average.
Which is terrifying for most people.
It is. But I look at the text's psychological breakdown of this moment and I frame this realization as a profound philosophical liberation. The wings are our fragile, ego-driven illusions. We built them out of the hustle mindset and the pressure to optimize every second of our lives.
I mean, sure, melting them is painful.
Very painful. The plunge is terrifying, but you have to melt the wax to finally touch solid ground. When you strip away the impossible demands of the ego, you can finally find peace in the simple, grounded realities of just existing.
See, I come at it from a completely different angle, because your interpretation relies on a massive assumption.
Which is?
That the ground you land on is actually solid and peaceful. The sociological realism in our text paints a much darker, much more systemic picture. Let's look at the sun in this allegory.
Okay.
It is not just some abstract internal philosophical concept of greatness. The sun represents the highly specific, hyper-capitalist ideal of extreme wealth, limitless influence, and fame. And crucially, it is weaponized against us.
Weaponized how?
Well, you're suggesting we can just take off the wings or let them melt and then happily walk away and tend to our gardens. But you can't just ignore the sun when it's actively burning you.
But if the hyper-capitalist sun is, as the text states, fundamentally unattainable for 99% of people, then the true trauma isn't being caused by the sun itself.
I don't know about that.
I mean, the sun is just sitting up there doing what the sun does, being a massive burning ball of inequity. The trauma is caused by our stubborn, culturally conditioned insistence on flying toward it.
But we're forced to look at it.
Are we, though? It is the toxic positivity that tells us we must be in the sky. If we recognize the pressure to hustle as the source of our suffering, then losing that drive, falling out of the sky, is a necessary corrective mechanism. It's like breaking a fever.
I hear you calling it a fever breaking, but I just don't buy that. Breaking a fever implies you're returning to a state of health.
Right.
But plunging into mediocrity in today's economy doesn't make you healthy, it drowns you. Look at the mechanics of how this culture operates. The source material specifically points out the algorithmic structure of our daily lives.
The social media aspect.
Average desk job. Instantly, you're hit with a 22-year-old driving a Lamborghini telling you how to manifest millions, or a colleague announcing their massive promotion.
It is definitely relentless.
It is. The algorithm literally monetizes your inadequacy. It forcefully demands your attention on that sun. Society is explicitly designed to make you feel like an absolute failure simply for paying your rent and surviving.
I see that.
So the trauma isn't just an internal ego death. It is the crushing daily realization that society only values the top 1%.
That is a very real structural problem. I agree. Social media acts as a magnifying glass for the sun. It focuses the heat of those expectations directly onto our self-esteem.
Right.
But in my view, that only makes the eventual melting of the wax more inevitable and more necessary. Why does this Fall of Icarus existential crisis typically happen exactly around age 35 or 40?
Well, the text digs into the psychology of this life stage.
Right. It happens because that is the exact moment when the biological and economic realities of adulthood finally overpower the toxic positivity of youth.
Because you just run out of steam.
Exactly. In your 20s, you have the surplus energy to maintain the illusion. You can work the 80-hour weeks. You can perform the hustle. But by 35, the energy it takes to keep those heavy, artificial wings flapping simply runs out. You hit a wall.
And what happens when you hit that wall? The text is completely explicit here. The psychological trauma of this realization is a leading cause of modern depression.
Yes, it's a very dark period.
We aren't talking about a gentle sigh of relief. We are talking about sheer grief. When the wings melt, you don't land in a meadow, you plunge into a cold, unforgiving sea. And modern society does not allow for a healthy mourning of this lost potential. You aren't permitted to just be average in peace, because the structural humiliations of not being wildly successful are everywhere. Your rent goes up, your wages stagnate, and the culture constantly reminds you that you didn't fly high enough.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it treats the depression as the end of the story rather than a necessary transition point.
A transition to what?
To survival. The text uses a very specific phrase. Surviving adulthood requires surviving the fall into mediocrity.
Surviving?
Yes. The word surviving implies a process. Yes, there is profound, agonizing grief, but mourning the extraordinary life we were promised is a necessary stage of psychological development. Hear me out. You essentially have to hold a funeral for the phantom future, the person you thought you were going to be, in order to fully inhabit the present reality of who you actually are.
But how do you hold a funeral when the culture is screaming at you that the deceased was the only part of you that mattered?
By recognizing that the culture is lying. The depression caused by this realization only becomes a permanent state of societal humiliation if you refuse to accept the reality of the fall.
Okay, but
If you keep thrashing in the water, looking up at the sky and wishing you were still up there, yes, you will drown. But once processed, accepting an average life is the only actual cure to the sickness of exceptionalism.
the only cure?
Yes. The grief is simply the bridge between a toxic illusion and a grounded reality. You strip the hyper-capitalist system of its ideological power over your self-worth. You stop letting the sun dictate your value.
That requires a level of ascetic, monk-like detachment that is practically impossible for an average person living in a modern economy.
I don't think it's impossible.
You are treating this grief as a purely internal psychological hurdle, a mindset shift. You are essentially saying, just realize the game is rigged, stop caring, and you'll be free.
In a way, yes.
But the text anchors this phenomenon in sociology, not just individual therapy. When you realize you are completely average, you are waking up to the reality of how the system treats average people materially. It is a system of profound economic precarity.
But isn't the psychological freedom the only thing we actually have control over? We can't single-handedly rewrite the tax code or dismantle social media algorithms.
True, but we can't pretend the psychological freedom insulates us from the material reality. The hyper-capitalist ideal mentioned in the text isn't just a bad vibe in your head. It is the structural reality of the world.
Right, but
Average people don't just feel bad. They are materially squeezed. When the wax melts and you fall into the sea, society doesn't throw you a life preserver. It looks down from the sky and says, you should have flown higher. If you can't afford a home, it's because you didn't grind hard enough.
that is incredibly cruel, yes.
The punishment for averageness isn't just emotional, it is structural.
I see the cruelty in that. I really do. If society looks down and says, you should have flown higher, it is incredibly difficult not to internalize that as a personal failure.
Exactly.
But the liberated mind, the mind that has survived the fall, looks back up and says, flying was destroying me.
That's a nice thought, but
The text focuses so heavily on the trauma of averageness precisely because of the dissonance between what we were promised and what is real. The promise of exceptionalism was a lie from the start.
a very convincing lie.
Yes, and the idea that you have to be extraordinary to deserve security or happiness is the toxic element. Yes, the system is unforgiving, but by accepting averageness, you protect your inner life from that cruelty. You stop performing. You can just be.
I think you are underestimating how difficult it is to just be when the entire ecosystem is designed to prevent it. And let's scale this up, because the text makes a critical pivot here that we need to address.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's look at the demographic experiencing this right now, the generations currently hitting their 30s and 40s. The text notes that this specific existential crisis is driving a massive spike in clinical depression and anxiety.
It is a profound mental health crisis.
We are not just looking at one individual's psychological journey. We are looking at a macro-level generational phenomenon. It is not just one solitary Icarus falling out of the sky.
No, it's millions of people.
It is an entire generation, millions of people, all equipped with the exact same defective wax wings manufactured by the exact same decades of toxic positivity.
Right.
And because of the biological and economic timelines we discussed, they are all hitting the exact same thermal layer of reality at the exact same time. The climax of this allegory isn't a single person quietly finding peace in a garden.
No, it's not.
It is a collective generational drowning. You have millions of people in the sea of mediocrity looking at each other, collectively mourning the extraordinary lives they were promised.
That is quite the image.
The tragedy is immense because the lie was so pervasive. How do you find peace when everyone around you is thrashing in the water, drowning in the exact same grief?
I have to concede the immense darkness in that framework. Recognizing that surviving the fall into mediocrity is incredibly difficult when an entire generation is drowning alongside you, it is a genuinely haunting image.
It really is.
The sheer scale of the grief is staggering. When you have a massive cohort of society simultaneously mourning a future they will never get to live, the cultural atmosphere becomes incredibly heavy. You can feel it in the art, in the humor, in the pervasive cynicism of modern internet culture.
Yeah, the humor is so bleak now.
Exactly. It is the sound of millions of people realizing they aren't going to be astronauts or billionaires or world changers. But even in that terrifying image of a collective drowning, I would argue that there is a paradoxical hope hidden in the sociology of it.
How so? Where's the hope in a generational drowning?
Because if everyone falls, then the sea becomes the new ground. Think about the mechanics of cultural shifts. The shared drowning might eventually become a shared, grounded reality.
The text points out that isolation makes the trauma worse, the feeling that you are the only one who failed to touch the sun. But if an entire generation recognizes that the wax wings were a trap and that the hyper-capitalist sun is a destructive illusion, they can begin to build meaning within that averageness.
That's a big if.
Maybe, but the sheer grief of mourning is a leading cause of depression right now. Yes,
But once that generation collectively processes the grief, they might be the first cohort in a century to actively dismantle the ideology of toxic positivity for the next generation.
You think they'll just stop the cycle?
Yes, they can look at their own kids and say you don't have to be extraordinary to be worthy of love. They can stop handing out wax wings.
That assumes the machinery of the system will allow them to stop handing out the wings.
Why wouldn't it?
Because the hyper-capitalist structure fundamentally relies on that toxic positivity to fuel its engines. It needs people striving for the sun. It needs them burning themselves out, chasing impossible standards, to maintain the productivity and consumption that keeps the economy moving.
Sure, it needs it, but
If everyone accepts averageness and stops striving, the engine stalls. The system will fight back against that kind of peace. That's why the algorithmic pressure I mentioned earlier is so relentless. It cannot afford for you to be content.
But that's exactly why the psychological rebellion is so vital. The system relies on our participation in the delusion.
But the system also enforces participation through material consequence. You can accept your averageness, you can find inner peace with your mediocrity, but your rent still goes up.
True.
Inflation still happens. The algorithm still floods your brain with status anxiety. The structural humiliations of not being exceptional remain intact. That is why I argue the fall isn't a liberation. It leaves you in a permanent state of vulnerability. You are tread watering in an ocean that wants to pull you under.
It may leave you economically vulnerable. That is the reality of the system we live in. But psychologically, philosophically, I maintain that surviving the fall builds a fortress.
A fortress.
Yes. Surviving adulthood requires surviving the fall into mediocrity. The trauma of realizing you are not special is profound, no doubt. It hurts because a very deeply ingrained part of the ego is dying.
Right.
When you finally accept that you are average, you no longer have to perform. You no longer have to constantly measure your worth against an impossible sun. The water might be cold, but at least you aren't on fire anymore.
I hear your perspective. The idea of extinguishing the fire of expectation is a beautiful philosophical goal.
Thank you.
But I remain anchored in the sociological reality of the text. The hypercapitalist sun and the mechanisms of modern culture ensure that averageness is perpetually punished.
It's definitely not easy.
No, it's not. It is not just about a bruised ego. It is about a system built on impossible promises that deliberately sets individuals up to fail and then leaves them to grieve and drown in the aftermath. The real trauma is the realization that the flight was rigged from the very beginning.
Well, we have unpacked a truly staggering amount of psychological weight today. We both agree that the myth of Icarus perfectly encapsulates the devastating existential crisis of modern adulthood.
Absolutely.
It provides a flawless framework for understanding why the trauma of averageness is driving so much of the modern mental health crisis.
We absolutely agree on the diagnosis. The cognitive dissonance between the exceptionalism we were force-fed as children and the stark mediocrity of our adult reality is crushing. It is a generational weight.
It is.
Where we remain divided is on the prognosis. You see the fall as a necessary transition and opportunity for ultimate liberation and the shedding of toxic illusions. I see it as a permanent state of societal humiliation, trapped in a system that refuses to let you exist peacefully in the middle.
And that tension is exactly why this source material is so profound. Unpacking the psychological weight of our societal myths offers endless avenues for understanding our modern misery, and perhaps figuring out a path toward survival.
Yeah, it really does.
It demands that we closely examine the ideologies we accept as truth. We invite the listener to deeply examine their own relationship to this myth. What impossible expectations are you carrying? Who handed you those wings? And whose sun are you exhausting yourself trying to reach?
Look in the mirror. Forgive yourself for not touching the sun. Because the fall is all there ever was.